Good afternoon to everyone, both in the room and also people following us online. I hope we're coming through loud and clear. And welcome on behalf of ATD Carmont, the Office of the High Commissioner, and I believe also the Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights himself. My name is Luc Doppendorf. I'm the Deputy Permanent Representative of Luxembourg, and I present first of all the excuses from our Ambassador Martin Schlomm, who can't be here today, but he's asked me to moderate the event in his absence. We're very happy for everybody to be here because this is going to be a very important and engaging summit, because we're looking at the Special Rapporteur's current report, but also his longer term work about eradicating poverty beyond the normal traditional ways in which we've tried and failed for so many years and decades to eradicate. And the particular focus for today is going to be the participation of people who live in poverty themselves, who have experienced poverty, who still experience poverty, and the importance of listening to their voices and hearing their solutions. There is a very famous saying in the human rights world, coined by activists of the peoples of the rights of people with disabilities, that says nothing about us without us. And I think this has really become a core truth of how the human rights movement operates. Every rights holder, every group of rights holders needs to be heard. And the Special Rapporteur himself has done fantastic work on this, which obviously he will be presenting much better than I could. But also this idea that there is discrimination against people in poverty, not just practically by the fact that they are that they don't have the many human rights that they are owed and that they are entirely entitled to, but also because of really active discrimination. Povertyism, the rapporteur called it in the report a couple of years back, by not seeing them as full human beings, by casting them aside, both physically but also in the way we think and talk about poverty. And I'm really very, very happy to that Luxembourg can support this side event fully, and that we can assist a little bit the Special Rapporteur and OHCHR and ATD Carmont, and also the other participants. And I do want to underline the importance of the support of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and the political support from the missions of Costa Rica, the Gambia and South Africa here in Geneva, so that we may move this agenda forward somehow. So we'll have 35 minutes, practically speaking, of presentation by the panelists, and then we'll open the floor for questions. I know there's people following online as well. I'm not entirely sure if they can ask questions as well, but I'm sure we'll see if that's a possibility. But I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions in the room already. So I'll very quickly introduce the panelists that we have here with us today. We have Bikramjit Batra from the Office of the High Commissioner, who's a human rights and democracy advisor in the rule of law section. And he's worked in a number of field offices, notably Palestine and Cambodia, and worked to support the commissions of inquiries on South Sudan and Syria. And he has previous experience with Amnesty International and as a lawyer in India. So that is a very long CV already. We have the High Commissioner, not the High Commissioner, sorry, perhaps one day, I'm sorry, anticipating things here. The Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. We need no introduction, Olivier de Schutter, who's an established and consummate scholar of the fight against poverty, former rapporteur on the right to food, and also a former member of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and Secretary General of Fédération Internationale des Droits de l'Homme. So really somebody with a pedigree in human rights that has few equals. And then we are very happy to have Ver Pinto Munoz, a co-researcher from ATD Fourth World. We jump right into it. I have a few suggested questions here, which I'll float before giving the floor to each of the panelists, but they will of course develop around that. And the guiding question for Special Rapporteur de Schutter is, well, the very simple one that you may have asked yourselves when you came in here: why is the participation of people in poverty so important in the fight against poverty?
Is an imperative not only to avoid committing mistakes, to focus on the right things, on the obstacles that they face, and on the solutions that they themselves have tried to develop. And that is a way to ensure that the interventions against poverty will be most effective. We would be foolish to do without the unique knowledge and experience that people in poverty have about the obstacles they encounter. That is why any policymaker should build on that knowledge in addition to the academic or expert knowledge, and in addition to the knowledge that organizations working with people in poverty have. And that is indeed the philosophy at the heart of the merging of knowledge approach pioneered by ATD Fourth World, which basically says we need 3 different sources of knowledge in combination with one another to arrive at viable solutions. That of academic experts, that of frontline organizations, but that also of people in poverty themselves. So policies against poverty will be more effective if they are better informed by that experience of people in poverty. However, it is also important to promote participation, not only as a means towards more effective policies, but also as an end in itself. Participation is empowering. It allows people in poverty to have an enhanced sense of self-esteem. It is a way to ensure that their knowledge is valued rather than ignored or sidelined. And it's very striking that in a study covering 6 countries, 3 from the global south and 3 from the global north, Bolivia, Bangladesh, and Tanzania in the south, the UK, the US, and France in the north, ATD Fourth World and the University of Oxford found that amongst the hidden dimensions of poverty, discussed at a very interesting one-day-long event in Washington with the World Bank and the IMF, and I look forward to saying more about that event, which I think is very promising and which was an opportunity to work with policymakers to understand how they could use this tool of improved participation to achieve better results in the fight against poverty.
Thank you very much indeed, Special Rapporteur, and that's certainly a very helpful point to pick up on. We're all, I mean, most of us in this room are government bureaucrats, and we are tool users by definition, and so we're certainly very, very eager to hear more about that. And with that, I would turn to Vera Punto-Munoz and ask about
knowledge, but unfortunately they couldn't make it today, so I made sure to prepare the intervention with Maria Angeles and Jose, who are 2 of these co-researchers. This only shows, in fact, how even when there's the good intention, when there's the welcome, even when there's the means to guarantee the participation of people in poverty, sometimes even life makes it difficult for them to be here. So I just wanted to say that before starting. So in this merging of knowledge of breaking the inheritance of poverty that was developed by ATD Fourth World in Spain, people living in poverty, but also academic experts and people from the world of activism and of professional social work, as Olivier said, carried out throughout 3 years this research to discuss what are the mechanisms that reproduce poverty from generation to generation, and most importantly, what are the keys to break that vicious circle. The participation of those concerned is at the very core, as Olivier explained, of this research, because Jose, Maria Angeles, and many others were for the first time not just objects of an investigation, but actual co-researchers that were seen as having an equal role to the scientists and to the activists or professionals throughout the whole process. I'm not sure if this sounds simple, probably not, but I can assure you that it really isn't. However, what we know in ATD, and as Olivier probably agrees with me, the results are always very worth the effort. Maybe later I can share some of the steps that are necessary to make this work and to guarantee the participation of people in poverty. So our research brings the attention to what has been named the baggage of the inheritance of poverty, which consists of a series of very heavy burdens that people in poverty carry, and that although they might be invisible to us or to the most part of society, they are very important barriers to the capacity that they have to participate, but also to change their lives in general. This baggage includes multiple elements, but some of them that I think are worth mentioning are the deeply rooted feelings of guilt and shame, as stated by the people in poverty during the research, the lack of a positive shared identity, and a self-image that's very influenced by the stigma and the discrimination that they face throughout their whole life. So, as Maria Angeles explains it, one big barrier to participation for those who have experienced poverty is the feeling that you don't have anything to say, that your experience isn't valuable. And I quote her when I say, "We can't feel good. Everything that happens in your life makes you have a self-concept that you are inferior. You grow up full of insecurities. These are feelings that, since you're a very little girl, make you believe that you have nothing to contribute." The prejudices towards people in poverty that we hold as a society, but also within our institutions, play a big role in this self-image that people in poverty have, and therefore are a key element to tackle if we want to foster the participation of those who live it. Another barrier is the feeling that they are not really welcome. It's not enough to invite them at the table. As Maria Angeles said, we need to feel like what we have to say is important, like it's going somewhere. I have already been invited to discussions where I've told my life story in front of a lot of people and where I felt completely naked afterwards. We can't be invited only as the problem. We have to be persons that are seen as part of the solution as well. Their knowledge and the contributions that people in poverty hold have to be seen and recognized as valuable, equally or even more so than others, because of the tremendous efforts that it takes for them to participate in these kinds of spaces. Finally, Maria Angeles told me that right now, at the very moment that we're discussing this, at the very moment we're discussing their participation in the UN, a father and a 6-year-old girl are being evicted from their home in the same neighborhood that she lives in. She said something that made me really angry, and I want to finish with that, hoping that it will spark in the room the energy to change things. She said, "You're going to be in the UN talking about our participation, but I can't stop thinking about that girl. What future is there for her? How will she ever find the courage to participate? We can't even imagine the impact that an eviction can have for a little girl like that. How will she look at herself, at her dad, at the institutions? What she lives now will scar her forever, and that is something that we need to stop." I'm going to finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. That's very powerful testimony, and it will be good to engage with Maria Angeles and the other persons who have the experience themselves in the future. And I think this is really on us as representatives of states and thereby duty bearers to listen, but listen, as you've said, allow people to participate fully, to be seen as full human beings with all their agency, with all their dignity, and not meet them with the easy paternalism that we white men in suits very often show. And I say this with all the necessary, I hope, humility that one needs to find in oneself. But we have tools again already in place. We have a very strong Office of the High Commissioner, a very strong international human rights system that has been working on finding solutions, human rights-based solutions for many years. And with that, I would like to turn to Bikram and ask you, Bikram, how is the participation of people living in poverty ensured and reflected within the human rights system? Do you have effective examples of participatory mechanisms? And can you say also a little bit about the 2018 guidelines on the right to participate? Thank you.
Thanks, Luke, and thank you to the organizers for having me here. It's a bit tough to follow after that tremendously strong ending, and it's very difficult to follow from the realities of the lived experience with rather prosaic, boring, what exactly is the human rights system doing. But you know, that's my role, so that's what I shall try and do briefly. Now, I think you asked a couple of important questions. How does the human rights system reflect the participation of people living in poverty? And perhaps I'll start with that. It's a little easier than answering how it ensures. So let me start with how it's reflected. And the general comment on the right to participation from 1996 makes a reference to the need for positive measures to overcome specific difficulties and includes poverty as one of them. But this limited reference to is in the rather specific context of the right to vote. There's been some more references to participation of persons with poverty by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in their general comments on housing, forced evictions, land and water. But perhaps I think it would be fair to say there is not that much direct reference to participation of people living in poverty in international human rights law and standards, as perhaps there ought to be. But this is partly also because the way the international human rights system looks at the broader principles of non-discrimination and equality, and this comes within sort of the other grounds of discrimination, socioeconomic status, and it's interesting then to look at how perhaps the human rights system needs to examine more the hidden dimensions, moving beyond the socioeconomic status. But we're not fully there yet. But as I'll come to, you will see how it's seeping in some of the later documents. Now, looking at so the groups that are being discriminated against, there's quite extensive coverage within the human rights system. CERD and CEDAW general recommendations reflect the importance of participation, of course, in their specific contexts. And this is keeping in mind that there's intersecting discriminations, and many of these groups are either living in poverty already or face high risk of poverty. Now, CEDAW has specifically noted concerns with respect to broadly feminization of poverty, but also more specifically women living in poverty, women in unpaid work, rural women, and women migrant workers. CERD has highlighted concerns regarding participation of ethnic minority groups, people of African descent, and historically vulnerable groups affected by poverty and inequality. By this they mean to cover indigenous people as well as persons of African descent. And of course the Committee on Child Rights and on people with disabilities have also taken up participation issues with respect to both these groups. Now, beyond these particular groups, the Human Rights Committee has also flagged issues of participation with respect to ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, historically deprived communities, low-income workers, and people from so-called lower castes who experience extreme poverty and marginalization. And in addition, other mechanisms and experts have noted the situation with respect to participation of internally displaced people, peasants and rural workers, sex workers, and people living with Hansen's disease or leprosy as we better know it. There are also some standards which I just want to flag in terms which are sort of interesting to keep in mind. The principles for older persons and the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other Workers working in rural areas, a more recent document which perhaps also when compared to some of the documents and reflections from the 1990s shows the development of the discussion even within the human rights system. And perhaps just to end this little bit in terms of how the human rights system reflects the discussion, the ongoing discussion or the current discussion now is very much around participation in the context of the right to development. As you're aware, there's a declaration and also a draft covenant, and I'd also like to mention here the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development's call for a model of planet-centered participatory development, which calls for both adopting an intersectional and bottom-up approach to participation. And so in that sense, I think the human rights system is also recognizing some of what they mentioned in terms of not perhaps going as far, but still getting in there. And on a tangent, because I don't want to get into sort of the regional level here, but one agreement that I think deserves a mention is the Escazú Agreement, or the regional agreement in Latin America and the Caribbean on access to information, public participation and justice in environmental matters, which also, of course, flags participation of indigenous groups and vulnerable situations as a priority area. Now, that was really a very quick overview of sort of how the human rights system is looking at the question, reflecting it. Ensuring, on the other hand, is perhaps $1 million question, and maybe, I can say, well, the key issue there really is one of political will of states, and I hope that people in the room will perhaps reflect a little bit more on that. But I can definitely point a few steps that the human rights system is taking to encourage that move or to move in that direction. And very quickly, maybe let me just flag a few points. Certainly in terms of recommendations which have been made by mechanisms and experts, some of the key ones which are really useful for to encourage participation and to ensure participation is pushing states and recommending states to enact national legislations and protocols on more effective participation and consultations. Even ratification of treaties. I mentioned the Escazú Agreement, that was one of them which CEDAW has recommended for. Developing national strategies, plans, which also include regular assessment and periodic reviews. And so we're talking about indicators, benchmarks, not just a strategy that goes nowhere. And collection of comprehensive statistics and disaggregated data for this assessment and overview to take place. One of the more regular recommendations we find is for states to adopt effective measures or special measures. And while I see that mechanisms don't often want to be prescriptive on what they may mean, I think some of them have made quite useful suggestions in terms of what they could be. And I'll just mention a couple, and there's more to discuss here. So whether these are quotas and targets for representation, or decentralization of powers and advisory consultative bodies, or even some creative ones, as I think came from, I think the Human Rights Committee on enhancing Roma employment within local authority administrations to effectively ensure that participation would take place. Despite all the policies and systems that were in place, there was still inherent structural discrimination which prevented that from happening. And where, of course, constitutions and other legal provisions have requirements for affirmative action, for those to be implemented, as was recommended by the Special Rapporteur on albinism in the case of Kenya, which requires a 5% representation. Maybe I can take a minute or so on that, and then I can sort of quickly flag. One of the key recommendations, which I think is quite useful, is also for creation of special mechanisms, ministries, bodies, focusing on participation of indigenous groups or marginalized groups, or any marginalized groups for that matter. We've seen this quite often coming from the CEDAW, from the Human Rights Committee in the context of indigenous affairs, and of course CERD, but also for more, if not national bodies, then for domestic mechanisms which can help interdepartmental coordination on many of these issues. And that's often been found to be a practical tool which would be quite useful. And of course, these to be done in coordination, in participation, and endorsed often by these groups for them to be really useful. Training of officials and support for organizations. I mean, much of the recommendations focus, and rightly so, on communities themselves, but also to recognize the role of representative organizations, which are often not getting the flow and also lack the funding. So there's recommendations around that, and for training and sensitizing of officials who have to engage, because it's all fine to have all these policies in place, but at the end of the day, it's the officials who have to make sure that those are being carried out. Perhaps I'll...
There's just so much, right?
I know that's... But maybe if I can take 1 minute to sort of flag within the United Nations itself, I think the Secretary General's Common Agenda flags really the importance of inclusion protection. Just to say that OHCHR in 2018, after a detailed process, produced these guidelines for states on effective implementation. And we've now been looking at how to take this work forward. And last year we did some further development of these in the context of persons with African descent. So I have a couple of copies here, they're also online. But just to flag that, obviously I'm not suggesting a cookie cutter approach here, but much of what was said in the context of persons of African descent does overlap, and many of them indeed live in poverty or face risks, but also much of that is also relevant given the intersecting vulnerabilities there. So I'm sorry for being very brief there, but I'll come back if there are more questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Vikram. There is just such an enormous wealth of knowledge to share, and we will pass from the UN's accumulated wealth of knowledge to that built up by civil society and the Special Rapporteur. And I will pass it over to Olivier and Vir together, because you've both published new tools and research this year on practical steps. And Vir, you spoke about this earlier, practical steps to break people out of poverty and improve participation. And I would like to pass the floor to you both to explain those.
That's very gracious of you. Veer was telling me I can start, so I will do so. We haven't coordinated between us. But let me indeed try to explain the current status of the debate concerning involving people in poverty in the policies that affect them. And I would like to start with this slide, which is a reminder of the results of this hidden dimensions of poverty work that was developed between 2016 and 2019 by a team of co-researchers, academic experts from Oxford University, ATD Fourth World, and people with direct experience of poverty. And the result was that whilst policymakers focus on definitions of poverty or understandings of poverty that refer to lack of decent work, to insufficient income, and to material and social deprivation in green in this scheme, other dimensions of poverty remain hidden in many official discussions. And those dimensions relate to the experience of discrimination, of humiliation, of one's contribution to society not being recognized, that people in poverty testified was part of the daily experience of what it means to be poor. And our conclusion is that we need to ensure that policymakers in their work use participation as a means to ensure that those hidden dimensions come to the fore. In other terms, it will not be enough to have social impact assessments measuring the impacts on poverty reduction or on inequalities. It will not even be enough to have human rights impact assessments to assess the impacts or the consequences of certain policies on the enjoyment of human rights. It is also important to ensure that the policy choices made involve people in poverty so that those dimensions can come from being invisible, albeit important in daily experience of people in poverty, to becoming much more visible. And so we started work on a new tool, and the next slide will illustrate this, which is the inclusive and deliberative elaboration and evaluation of policies tool, IDEEP in short, which essentially is a methodology that we advocate for policymakers to use to ensure that participation of people in poverty is not tokenistic, not symbolic, not simply there to legitimize options decided without them, but is the result of a genuine co-construction. Now that is not easy, because we first need people in poverty to be confident that they have something meaningful to say that will be taken into account effectively by policymakers. So we need to build this trust in the process. We need to address all the material obstacles to participation, including financial, but also access to information and to adequate data is important to enhance that participation. And it's important to have a procedure that ensures that the voices of people in poverty can be effectively involved in shaping the decisions. And again, these voices should not be simply there to legitimize post hoc decisions made without them. It should be voices that contribute to co-constructing solutions. And so, of course, I have no time to describe the ID tool, but it basically defines a way to achieve this with different phases that result in a sort of dialectic process through which solutions end up being shaped. And perhaps the key word here, Luc, is that you used at the start of our exchange, humility. Humility. I think policymakers, sitting in institutions, in governmental bodies, they have an understanding of poverty. That is one perspective which is not a substitute for the perspective that the real experts, people in poverty themselves, can provide. And we have to be humble in searching for solutions recognizing the limitations of the technocratic approach to addressing poverty. When I worked on the report on non-take-up of rights with my team, including Agatha Osinski, a long-time collaborator with ATD Fourth World, we were struck by the fact that many reasons for people not claiming their rights, not being able to exercise their rights, were reasons people in poverty could very well explain, but which policymakers had not really taken into account. We failed to really understand why people do not claim child allowances, unemployment benefits, for example, or why they fail to file a claim against the exclusion from certain social services unless we involve people in poverty in doing this. And the report we produced on non-take-up of rights exemplifies how we can use in the most positive way possible that co-construction with people in poverty. The ID tool was discussed in Washington. We had a one-day meeting with the World Bank and the IMF where 120 development practitioners were brought together with AD Fourth World and myself, and we had a fascinating discussion which I believe opened the eyes of many policymakers to the fact that we invest, of course, time and energy in organizing these discussions, but they are actually a way to save time and energy because we avoid making mistakes and we can more precisely address the very concrete obstacles that people in poverty face. And my hope now is that policymakers will understand that it is not simply as a matter of a legal obligation that they must ensure participation, it's also in their own interest to be empowered by the knowledge they can be served to identify better solutions. And that is my hope, that the case studies we develop, that the tools we try to test on the ground will influence the way policymakers understand their role in combating poverty. Olivier, thank you.
Thank you, Olivier, and it's very good luck because of course the ID tool is a great example of what set of steps have to be taken forward to guarantee that the effective participation of poverty is really there, and it's not just a tokenistic experience, as you said before. And I because you didn't have the time to speak about that, it's lucky because I prepared some of those steps that throughout the experience of ATD Fourth World across the years, people in poverty have taught a lot to us on what are the necessary conditions that have to be there for that to happen. So the merging of knowledge is developed based on that learnings, on what has to be there so that the participation is effective, is real, and is empowering as well. So I wanted to highlight some of these steps that are very practical, but hopefully useful to some of the people in the room and to the discussion in general. One of the big learnings from the merging of knowledge is the importance of bringing people together to work in peer groups. What does this mean? It means putting people together with the people that have a shared experience, a similar language, a shared way of experiencing and of seeing things, before putting them all together in the same room. So in the merging of knowledge, a basic step, a basic condition is that people in poverty, before being face-to-face with academic experts, with professionals, that are usually people who intimidate them, who are people who usually they feel judged by them, they are put together with other people with the experience of poverty so that they can develop a shared knowledge. They can put together their contributions so that afterwards they feel empowered to share it with the others. But the other groups are also forced to do that same step. So academics and also practitioners or people from organizations are also forced to go through that step, to also learn to feel like their knowledge is one single, and then that allows for the merging to actually take place safely for the people who live in poverty, but also for the academics and for the practitioners. Another very important step is the care for language. This doesn't only mean that academic experts and practitioners have to adapt their language and kind of simplify the things they have to say, which is also an important thing. It's also about the taking care of explaining things. of not assuming that everyone in the room knows what you're talking about, uses the same expressions, uses the same way of speaking, and that's something that I feel we have a lot to learn about also in the Conseil. It's about knowing that there's a whole kind of process to do together so that we all speak the same language, and that's a very important step for people in poverty to actually be able to fully participate in the conversation and feel like they have something to say. Another one would be the willingness of all actors to be transformed by the process, and that's one of the points that Olivier raised as well, which is the importance of every single actor. That means the people with the experience of poverty, but also the authorities involved, also the practitioners involved, to be ready to be transformed by what the other actors have to say, and also to transform others by what you have to say, but that's not as easy as it seems sometimes. Another one would be that the pace is respectful to the rhythm of those who are less used to being in these deliberatory spaces. So to adapt the stages to go a bit slower than maybe what we are used to do in this room. So we make sure that people who are less accustomed to these discussions can follow up and can fully participate and not just say yes at the end to give the sign, as Olivier said. And finally, which is I think maybe the most important and the most key aspect, is the recognition and the value that has to be given to all the different knowledge groups, all the different people who participate to the process. And most importantly, of course, the people in poverty who are traditionally told that their knowledge is not really important, that what they have to say is not really valuable, and that their experience is not really something to be shared. So a key of the merging of knowledge, a key of the IDIP, a key of how to guarantee that people in poverty participate fully and effectively is to make sure that we state from the very beginning, but all throughout the process, what you have to say is important. And what you have to say is going to teach us all a lot about how to do better. And maybe just before finishing, I wanted to share maybe also a good practice or an example of how this can actually lead to good policies, can actually lead to effective policies. So for example, a merging of knowledge that was finished last year here in Switzerland, that's called Poverty Identity Society, that looks at the relationship between people in poverty and institutions and how that relationship has traditionally maybe been complicated sometimes, but there are steps that can be made for that to be transformed. The results were published last year, and since then a group of co-researchers, including of course people with the experience of poverty, have been non-stop going to trainings in universities, discussions with social practitioners, but also conversations with the Swiss institutions, the federal government, who is very interested in discussing how can we shape policies based on that merging of knowledge. And that is not only important in the content, in the fact that these institutions are really going to take into account our learnings from this merging, it's also the fact that people with the experience of poverty are going to burn to discuss with people from the federal government what has to be transformed in their lives, what doesn't work for them and for their children, and that already, I think, is a big win as a society, and it's something that we have to learn from.
Thank you very much, Vera, and it's always good to have positive news from our gracious host country as well. We will open out the floor for a couple of questions and comments, and I'll give it back to the panelists afterwards and let Olivier have the last word, also to establish the link with your current report to the Human Rights Council, Olivier. So if there's questions or comments in the room, please raise your name plate, and at that moment, or if you don't have one, raise your hand, please introduce yourself and go ahead, sir.
Yes, I'm part of ATD also, but I'm also the representative here of the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors. I have one question to Mr. Batra and one to Mr. De Schutter. To Mr. Batra, I would ask, in the examples that you gave of human rights kind of text, you didn't mention actually the guiding principles on extreme poverty and human rights. So I wondered why you didn't do that, because this is one of the key results, let's say, of the special rapporteurs, in particular of Magdalena Sepúlveda, and what would be the things that the Office of the Human Rights could do in order to divulge that better and to make sure that people in elsewhere know about it. And that is my question to you. The question to Olivier is, well, yeah, this I-Deep kind of thing is fantastic, but you know, how can we make it work? Whom should we try to influence? How do you think we can influence those people? You know, can you say a little bit more about it? Whom you think we should try to reach with that? Huh? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions already to start off. I'm quickly looking around. The representative of the bloc, Giovanni, did you tell me?
Thanks very much. I'm Maria Mercedes Rossi, Comunità Padovana 23, G23. First of all, thanks very much for your inputs that are excellent. I wanted to ask the same question of the colleague from ATD Carmode about the guiding principle on street poverty. And in the paragraph that are pertaining participation in the guiding principle from 37 to 41, it says 4 important objectives. One is active, free, informed and meaningful participation. Active, free and meaningful are also the 3 attributes of the participation in the Declaration of the Right to Development in the draft International Covenant. So my question is related to the issue of information that is also crucial, this informed participation. If you can also elaborate, also according to the experience of Paty de Carmode, because it is the first step, you know, people should be really informed of what is going on. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Very helpful question as well. I don't see any other requests for. I do have one here in front. Last one, please.
Hi, we have a question from a participant online. They're asking the panel to please reflect on the dimension of political power in your call for genuine and inclusive participation, and how can the processes mentioned here become embedded in actual political rights?
Thanks very much to the participant online. I actually have in my notes here that none of this works if we don't have proper power analysis and a proper, and Vikram, you mentioned political will already, but a fundamental readiness of those in power to hold up their bargain of the social contract. And that means breaking down established patriarchal power structures, some of them political, some of them economic, and be ready to share power and wealth and fulfill the social contract between states and citizens of fulfilling rights. But you haven't come here to listen to me, but to the panelists. Vikram, perhaps I can start with Magdalena Sepulveda's guidance.
Sure. I mean, the short answer for that is I presume that was a starting point for the conversation, and so you may not have noted that actually I didn't talk much about the special rapporteur's mandates work on this, partly because it wasn't really my place to do that, and I figured others would talk about that work. But yes, absolutely, the guiding principles are an essential document in this discussion, and it's how are we taking that forward? I mean, I think if you look at the guidelines that we did in 2018, which are much broader because they're guidelines on effective participation, not only in the context of people living in poverty, but for all groups. If you reflect and compare the two, you will see a lot of it is, I would say, inspired necessarily, but definitely you will see commonalities and overlaps. So I think it is definitely seeped into other parts of the human rights system, and it's an important part of our engagement with it. So yes, simply to say that it was there, but I figured there was no point stressing it in this audience, which would be well aware of them. And I wanted to cover some of the other developments. On the second question, I think that was sort of to me on information to flag. I mean, information definitely is the starting point for any participation process. It's a key ingredient, but shouldn't be the whole of it. And I think the Human Rights Committee in its General Comment 34 on freedom of information, specifically freedom of expression, specifically notes the importance of information in any participation process. Now, there's quite good activities, and that I think the best way of doing that is also engaging with the communities in question to find what works best for them. So again, the sharing of information cannot itself be outside of the participatory approach. It is an inherent part of participation, but also must take place in a participatory manner.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I want to hand for the last 3 minutes over to Vera and Olivier for you to have the last one.
Yes, so just to respond very quickly to the question on information. So I would say that maybe one key to kind of jump over this barrier of the information or lack of information is, first of all, I think, to not be paternalistic with people who experience poverty, because, as I said, they hold great knowledge on what they go through, and they hold great knowledge on how the system works, maybe better than some of us because they experience it daily. However, it's important when we try to share information, when we try to rise on them the interest to participate in certain participatory processes, is to link the interest of that process with their lives and what the concerns that they have on their daily lives. And for that, maybe one very important thing is to trust and link up and partner up with local organizations who are doing great work on the ground, together with that people who already have that relationship of trust and that can really make the connection between institutions and the people who are experiencing all these difficulties on the ground. Thank you.
Great. 3 points in the minutes that remains. First, in answer to Wouter van Gieliken's remarks, yes, the guiding principles on extreme poverty and human rights are grossly ignored in recent debates and since 2012 when they were adopted. And of course we can refer to the fact that Magdalena Sepulveda has organized the consultations is not sufficient because of the sociology of political elites, because of the links between economic marginalization and political disempowerment, and because, most importantly, because of the type of knowledge that is mobilized in political decision-making, which is top-down, not bottom-up, technocratic, not democratic. And I close finally in answering the question of Luc Dokendorff. The report I presented today on eradicating poverty beyond growth is really a call to ensure that we focus on what really matters to people, not on what matters to policymakers who believe that wealth creation is a substitute for improved well-being and the realization of human rights. And that is the default option, right? As if more were always better, as if increasing production and consumption were the answer to social exclusion and poverty. And that, unfortunately, is not always the case. The relationship between GDP growth and poverty eradication and the reduction of inequalities is very uncertain at best. And that is the message of my report. I think if involving people in poverty in shaping decisions were made more systematic and real, we would focus on what matters most to people rather than on the fetish of economic growth.
Thank you.
Magnifique.